Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Her Majesty Queen Rania Al Abdullah of Jordan. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Her Majesty Queen Rania Al Abdullah of Jordan. Your Majesty, Queen Rania, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear friends and colleagues, it's a pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of TRT World to this, our fourth session of the day, a session that focuses on fostering global consciousness in times of crises. I'm Ghida Fakhry, and I'm delighted to moderate this discussion where we focus on one urgent and critical issue, and that is the global refugee crisis. Now, while the magnitude of this human tragedy is still unfolding before our very eyes, while it is being weighed and debated, one issue is becoming absolutely clear. It is that this is becoming worse, and the sheer numbers of displaced people around the world is becoming bigger every single day. According to the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, the estimates are that there are more than 68.5 million displaced people around the world and the globe. And when you think of it, that is the biggest number since World War II. And just to put it in a little bit of a context, think about the population of the UK. Well, this number is bigger than the entire population of the United Kingdom. In fact, it's just a little smaller than the population of Turkey. And among these 68.5 million people, more than 25 million have fled their homes to other countries. Over half of them are under the age of 18, most of them fleeing from 3 countries, for the most part, Syria, Afghanistan, and South Sudan. And it's probably no surprise to any of us here that 85% of the world's displaced people are in developing countries. Although the numbers give us an idea of the magnitude, they all too often make us forget, I think, quite an obvious reality. The fact that this issue goes beyond the numbers, that it isn't just about the sheer numbers, the scale of it, the statistics. It's about every single individual life that is affected. And while the world, or at least parts of the world, have struggled for many decades with refugees and how to deal with them, it has now, in the last couple of years, taken on a new sense of urgency, an urgency that may well have to do with the fact that there has been an extraordinary influx of refugees from Syria, from other parts of the world as well, the Middle East and North Africa, certainly, to Europe. At least, though, for now, you might say the plight of refugees is at the forefront of the international agenda. It has taken center stage, for good or bad, in political debates across many European capitals, giving, in some cases, rise to expressions, dangerous expressions of populism, but in some cases as well, to expressions of support. But it is the countries in the region that have taken on the burden, that have shouldered the responsibility, countries like Jordan, like Lebanon, like Turkey. Amnesty International accused the world's wealthiest nations of leaving poorer countries to bear the brunt of this global refugee crisis. In fact, 10 countries, which account for just 2.5% of the global economy, are hosting more than half of the world's refugees. And all of these countries, you've guessed, are in the Middle East, in Africa, and in South Asia. Jordan is one of the countries most affected by this crisis, with the second highest share of refugees to its population, just after Lebanon, a situation that is no doubt putting strains on the geopolitical equilibrium, strains to the point of, I wouldn't say collapse, but near collapse, certainly a real set of pressures that are brought to bear. So what can we do to help these middle-income countries cope? How are they coping on their own, and what should the international community do to help? What can we do to change mindsets as well, to see refugees, most of them women and children, as people, not just as numbers, as fellow human beings, not as mere statistics or as a security threat? How do we put, in other words, our humanity before our vested political interests? Well, it's now my honor to invite our keynote speaker, Queen Rania Al Abdullah, to share her thoughts on what I believe is for her a vital issue for her and for her country. Queen Rania, the floor is yours.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Ghida, for that kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be in Turkey once more. Our two nations are bound not only by friendship, but by a long history of cooperation and shared beliefs. Like Jordan, Turkey has felt the shockwaves of turmoil within our region. And like us, you remain steadfast in your commitment to the millions of refugees you have welcomed inside your borders. For centuries, this land has served as an intellectual hub where trade routes, populations, and ideas intersect. Today, I am delighted to contribute to that tradition and take part in this forum. Our worldviews may be different, but rooted deep in the core of our humanity, we share the same overarching aspirations for the world: peace, justice, and security for all. The realization of these ideals is a constant, unyielding struggle, one that no nation can wage on its own. But it must remain our common mission, because when we falter, the innocent are the first to pay the price. Like Alan Kurdi, it has been 3 years since his lifeless body was recovered on a beach near Bodrum. He, along with his brother and mother, lost their lives in an effort to escape the brutality of the Syrian conflict. In death, he quickly became a symbol of the struggles of more than 5.5 million Syrian refugees. For a brief moment, this snapshot of senseless loss seemed poised to serve as a turning point in the global refugee crisis. It forced the world to confront the true cost of war and the terrifying outcome of global inaction. But the political and humanitarian will it generated was short-lived. Almost as suddenly as it had appeared, concern for the refugee crisis once again receded, a casualty of the ebb and flow of human compassion. More than 10,000 people have since drowned attempting to make the same perilous trip across the Mediterranean. Instead of serving as a call to action, their deaths have been tuned out or treated as background noise. In decades past, experts warned that the 24-hour news cycle would desensitize us to images of horror. Today, such concerns seem almost quaint. Footage of human misery is now inescapable, streaming constantly through our screens and flooding our social media feeds. We have grown accustomed to news of the displaced dying at sea, to images of bloody children pulled from rubble, to gutted homes and entire neighborhoods reduced to debris. Every day, we are bombarded with evidence of suffering, until images that once felt painfully familiar gradually stop being painful. The names and faces blur, and the mosaic of misery is distorted into static. One of the key facets of human nature is the universal impulse to help those in need. On the individual level, this reflex to lend a helping hand is very effective. But in the face of mass atrocities, too often, we fail to move decisively. Our hearts break when we hear the story of a mother forced to bury her child, a family targeted for their religious beliefs, or a village being purposely burned to the ground. Yet, much of the world remains unfazed by genocide in Myanmar, where more than 25,000 Muslim Rohingya have been brutally murdered, and more than 900,000 driven from their homes. Psychologists describe this phenomenon as psychic numbing. We recognize a single person's suffering as a tragedy, but as the number of those affected piles up, that tragedy begins to lose its emotional grip. This is partly a protective measure, a way to insulate ourselves from others' pain. But perhaps the greatest obstacle to action is the sense of helplessness. Many resign themselves to the idea that there is nothing they can do. They tell themselves that any efforts to improve our world will be offered in vain. History, however, tells a much different and more hopeful story. The headlines may lead us to believe that the world is gradually becoming less secure, but the trend lines suggest otherwise. We have already made incredible headway in turning the world into a safer, more inclusive home. Before the Industrial Revolution, war accounted for about 15% of human deaths. By the 1900s, that figure had fallen to 5%. Today, it stands at 1%. Heart disease is now the world's leading cause of death, whereas violence doesn't even crack the top 10. Meanwhile, quality of life is improving. Since 1990, nearly 1.1 billion people have escaped extreme poverty. More people have access to clean water, electricity, and medical care than ever before. And we are better educated, achieving an unprecedented global literacy rate of over 85%. We refused to accept the status quo, and so we succeeded in changing it. Time and again, we have proven that progress is possible. Humankind has already made exceptional strides, and the momentum is on our side. So why stop here? After all, there are many challenges we have yet to overcome. 1 in 5 children around the world are out of school, including more than 15 million in the Middle East alone. Last year, 10,000 youth worldwide were killed or maimed in armed conflict. And each day, 44,000 people are displaced from their homes. The task before us may seem intimidating until we remember that we are capable of incredible things. And we have come too far to quit now while we're ahead. Ask the journalists in the refugee camps. the first responders to national disasters, or the aid workers helping thousands get back on their feet, they will tell you that images of desperation are one part of our planet's narrative, but they don't tell the whole story. Determination, strength, community, joy, even in the darkest of places, the best of humanity continues to shine through. Among the heartache, there is so much life left to cherish. Now is no time to disengage. Instead of despairing for all that we have lost, we must fight for the innocence we have left to protect. Mourn the dead, then redouble our efforts toward the living. It was Martin Luther King Jr. who said, "We must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope." Our challenge today and every day is to confront the harshest realities of our world without losing sight of our ideals, and to remain steadfast in our refusal to accept the unacceptable. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much indeed to Queen Rania for these empowering and inspiring words, for refusing to stop. As Her Majesty said, there is much work left to be done at a time when we faced what she called an intimidating task, but we refused to accept the status quo. Now is not the time to disengage or despair, but it's the time to fight for all we have left to fight for. And on this note, it is now my pleasure to welcome to the stage our distinguished panelists with whom we are going to dissect and analyze and discuss this issue. How do we develop and nurture a new global consciousness in times of crisis? I'm pleased to be joined on the stage by Ibrahim Eren, Director General and Chairman of TRT, Francesco Rocca, President of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, Burgi Brende, President of the World Economic Forum, and last but not least, Pierre, Krähenbühl, Unrwa Commissioner General. Yes. Sure. Please let me. Lovely to meet you all, gentlemen. Welcome. Wonderful. So as our panelists take their seats, we will begin our discussion. And as I look at, again, the issue that we will be focusing on, fostering global consciousness in times of crisis, I will turn to you first, Director General and Chairman of TRT, Ibrahim Eren. I think it might be wise to begin with you. TRT World, I have learned, and I've been working with this network for about a year, was launched a couple of years ago to coincide with the Syrian refugee crisis at a time when it was, in fact, at its height. I heard you speak last night and say that the network was born as a result of this crisis to, in your words, construct a new media language centered around human beings. In practical terms, what has that meant?
Today, let me introduce a TRT World, as you have mentioned before, how it is launched, and why we thought that there's a need, a new language in the media, and which is the outcome. The outcome is TRT World, and then in the practical terms, what we have done for the sake of the language we chose. Last year's forum highlighted the challenges the world has been facing for some time now, and the subject were, maybe you may remember, inspiring change in an age of uncertainty. Little has changed since the last year, and this year forum theme is on the question of fragmentation, because the world is fragmented today more than ever. International community is failing to effectively address the most fundamental issues of our time. And then this is leading to deepening the problems of injustice, inequality, cruelty, and discrimination across the world. So call for justice becoming louder, yet no mechanism to deliver that justice. The United Nations, which is charged with addressing these issues, falls short of fulfilling these demands. Conflicts, wars, terrorism are producing millions of refugees. Xenophobia, hatred, Islamophobia are forcing us to question if mutual understanding and ideals ever existed in the first place. So exclusion replaced inclusion in the last years. And environment is also exposed to the destructive consequences of that fragmentation, which we have seen last year's environmental summits. The need to develop a collective response to our shared issues is desperately becoming more apparent. With this mind, fostering global consciousness is important is very important. So the first step is placing the notion of human security at the top of our agenda. And we believe that it is not just TRT World, but everyone's responsibility to find a solution to the world's problems on all levels. And so the media is as well. And media networks also have a large share of the responsibility. As Malcolm X once did say, the media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent. And that is power, because they control the minds of the masses. Of course, the media has transformed. New forms of media and platforms we have seen now exist, but still the mainstream media, the TV and the other media is the first source of news consumption. And so what we thought that TRT World's responsibility, because we think that a media outlet should be responsible for, like, images are very powerful and can make global headlines, define narratives, and move leaders to take action. And we have two concrete examples in the last 2 years, which one is Aylan Kurdi in Aegean Sea, and the second one is Ömran Daknish in Aleppo.
May I interrupt you here?
Yes.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you've raised so many interesting issues and points that I would love to follow up on. And I do know that you may have to leave us a little earlier than the other panelists. So let me ask you this. I mean, you mentioned a host of very pertinent points. You talk about human security. You say the international community has failed in many instances, certainly on the issue of refugees. But I wonder, is it the job of international news organizations to step in? You talk about social responsibility, but how much of a fine line is there between real journalism and social activism in a way? And where do politics fit in? Because for a network like TRT World, let's face it, which is based here in Turkey, Turkey has a real stake in what is going on in Syria. You have some 4 million Syrian refugees in the country. You've got troops in Syria as we speak. How much does politics determine what you cover and how you cover it when it comes to this issue?
This is why we we placed the human in the center of all our news. So without differentiating ethnicity, religion, or region, we placed human at the center of our media coverage. And so we thought that the human life is more important than anything else. And sometimes I give the example that if you see as a journalist or as a cameraman, that if when you are in the field and you see a position that you would like to shoot it, you would like to shoot that scene, but if the person is in danger and you have to help, then you can drop the camera and you have first. This is the first training that we gave to cameramen in the first phase. So this is a different approach from, I think, the other news outlets. So and for this reason, for the collective understanding in the newsroom, to have that kind of understanding in the newsroom, we initiated a platform called TRT World Citizen. The main idea was not actually, okay, we are making humanitarian aid, not by the public sources, of course, by the source of the TRT World employees, but the main idea was to integrate the style guide, the editorial guideline we have with the life of the people that work for the TRT World. So, like our Syria coverage, let's say, has centered mostly on the stories and lives of the refugees and their obstacles, as opposed to political calculations.
But can it be done completely objectively, devoid of these political calculations?
We don't use, at TRT World, I don't use the word objective, but I use the word balanced, because you can't be objective as a human being. Sometimes there's right to do, and you are trying to be just balanced rather than being objective.
And as you say, Director General Eren, we are first and foremost human beings before being journalists and before having all the other professions we have. I look at you now, Francesco Rocca, and wanted to move to you as the head of what is today the largest humanitarian organization, quite a challenging, daunting task with everything that's going on in the world around us. Just picking up from what Director General Eren just said, to what extent, and what we just heard Queen Rania mention as well about the stereotypes, the images we see that get so embedded in our conscious and that actually propel us either to do something about the situation or not. How do you look at the current discourse and narrative within the media, the mainstream Western media, when it comes to the issue of refugees and migrants, how they are depicted and how they are referred to, and how it affects your job as a humanitarian person?
No, I think that it doesn't affect only my job. It affects also me as a human being. The way many media are depicting the migrants in this moment is a way that is stealing their story, their dignity. When you label a person only as irregular, this is and means that you are forgetting intentionally what they are fleeing from. That they are human beings with a story, with relatives, with their own feeling of belonging to a country that they were forced to flee. So this is something that is really concerning, that is increasing. Of course, the media, many of the time, are following the politicians in this. They are the first that started this way. And this is starting in discussing about the Western politics. And this is a reason more for being concerned.
But are many of these politicians right, in a way, to see the refugee issue as a security problem?
Yeah, but this is a problem. When it is only treated as a security, and dehumanizing the problem, it's increased the threat. It's not dealing with the problem that we normally face. When you treat and deal with the problem of the people, this helps us to simplify the dynamic at social level. I think that the way the Western countries and Europe in particular is approaching this phenomena is just starting from the world. They started to call it as an emergency, denying that it was a phenomenon. And I want to give you just as an example that I often use in my humanitarian experience. I started to be a volunteer in Italy more than 30 years ago, dealing with people that at that time was living and was fleeing the Horn of Africa. After 30 years in Europe, in the Italian shores, we are receiving people fleeing from Horn of Africa. So that means, back to the point the General Director touched, this is the show how big is the failure of the international community in dealing with certain crises. And this is a matter of fact that is undeniable.
But particularly, just a quick follow-up, when you talk about the failure, in the European context, when you look at the leaders across the political spectrum, do you feel that they should be doing more? I mean, I know now there is a policy of delegation where most member states of the EU have left the issue to the likes of Greece and Italy to deal with this issue, and they've also dealt with it with a policy of externalization. Let it be those who are in the region of these countries that are being affected deal with this. Is that fair enough? Should they be doing more?
No, this is I think it's a mistake, but it's a consequence of this lack of vision of our leaders in this moment. Again, while I'm underlining the difference between emergency and a phenomena, because dealing as an emergency is helping them in setting up policies that are not dealing with the real problem, and denying the fact that there are no, in the past and even in the current days, no one is tackling the root of causes that force the people to flee. Mm-hmm. This is the main fault of the Western country in this moment, and all the superpowers. Yeah. Then, of course, in dealing is not easy. Is not an easy task, but this is another aspect of.
And perhaps, Mr. Rocca, as you say, many politicians and some of us in the media actually tend to conflate the issue of refugees and migrants. And I wonder if we're doing ourselves a favor by doing this, because as you say, refugees really have to flee situations of persecution and violence. Burgi Brende, you've served in various capacities within the Norwegian government, most recently as foreign minister between 2013 2017, and before that, Minister of the Environment and Minister of Trade and Industry. But now we speak to you here as President of the World Economic Forum. And I know that in this capacity, you've been in touch with highly influential people. I watched you interview just last month within the context of the World Economic Forum in Hanoi, one of those influential leaders who a lot of people are becoming increasingly critical of for not doing more on the question of the Rohingya, Aung San Suu Kyi. I just wonder, when we talk about this issue, and we know that there are close to 750,000 Rohingya refugees who've been forced to flee to neighboring Bangladesh to get some shelter there within the UN refugee camps, what do you make of the words that you hear from people like Aung San Suu Kyi?
So I was in a situation where I was able to ask Aung San Suu Kyi these questions. World Economic Forum, we had our 27th ASEAN meeting, and Aung San Suu Kyi was there as the de facto leader of Myanmar. And I raised with her the challenges now that the Rohingyas are faced with, and also the question of repatriation, because 750,000, as you have said, have fled to Bangladesh, and what are the plans for receiving them back. And I also asked her in hindsight if she regretted the way it was handled. And I think this was also in the media, where she said in the conversation that there were aspects of this that she in hindsight would have liked to dealt with differently. But we also know that Myanmar is a very complex country, in the sense that 25% of the MPs are not elected by the people. These are elected by the military. So that's part of the equation. I think on the larger refugee issue, we have now around 65 million people that are refugees globally. I think we all have a responsibility to deal with this. But at the same time, we're saying that in times of crisis, I would say that there are a lot of crises globally, but also, as Her Majesty Queen Rania underlined, we also have seen progress in many areas during the last decades. You know, in 1990, 40% of the global population lived in extreme poverty, and we were 5 billion people. Today, 10% live in extreme poverty, and we are in 7 billion people. We added more people to our planet in 28 years than lived on our planet in 1900. And at the same time, we reduced the amount in percent living in extreme poverty from 40 to 10%. I think this shows the potential. So I think also in times where we are seeing crisis, humanitarian catastrophes that we haven't seen since the Second World War, not far from here in Aleppo and in Syria. We also know that we really can make a huge difference if we collaborate and pull together. That's why, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, by 2030, eradicating all extreme poverty. This is possible, but it is not possible if we don't work together and if we see increased geopolitical competition.
And as you say, and as we mentioned at the outset, the issue of the Rohingya, just today I got a Facebook message from a refugee from Myanmar, so I suppose a Rohingya young girl whose name is Noor. She says she's been living in the refugee camps in Bangladesh for over a year. Her only complaint, and I don't know where I put my phone to read out the message, but her only complaint was that she couldn't read enough where she was. So she was asking for any kind of help to be able to read more, to be able to travel to places like the United States. Probably not the right time. A lot of obstacles are being put up. As a Norwegian politician, I wanted to ask you this, Mr. Brende. Is Europe, in your opinion, committing the same mistakes of the past by shunning people who seem to threaten the very essence of the socio-economic fabric in these societies? Is that the mistake that's being done? Or has this become today, being honest, has it become a political necessity to shun some of these people?
I'm not in the capacity anymore to talk on behalf of my country, sure. But I can, as the president of the World Economic Forum, as an impartial, neutral international organization for public-private cooperation, address this thing. And I think this is also a nuanced picture, because I think we also have to recognize that many European countries have taken big responsibility when it comes to receiving refugees. I would, of course, use this opportunity to send a special thank you to the host country, Turkey. No country have received so many refugees globally as Turkey, more than 4 million. Not only Syrians, but Iraqis, people from Afghanistan. We also have the same in Jordan, Lebanon. But let's not forget that Germany received 1 million. We have also seen that Scandinavian countries, Sweden received many hundred thousands. If you look at a proportion of population, Norway, my country, we received, when we were in government, when I was in government, we were among the top countries if you looked at this compared to population. We are 5 million people, and we received many. But also, as was addressed here, we cannot solve this problem without going to the root causes. And the root causes are proxy conflicts. The root causes is poverty, illiteracy, and all this has to be dealt with. Also, when it comes to creating opportunities for younger generations. And as you as a moderator also addressed very correctly, is that we have to make a distinction here between migrants and refugees. We are internationally committed to deal with refugees according to what we have committed to. But of course, what we will see in the coming decades, when we move from 1.2 billion people in Africa to 2 billion by 2050, is the pressure on the migration. What we've seen so far, to use a Nordic term, is only the tip of the iceberg. And if we don't step up through a Marshall Plan when it comes to investment and creating the right conditions for development in Africa, those problems are not African problems. These are global problems and not at least European problems. So we have just seen the tip of the iceberg.
The tip of the iceberg, and I do want to come back to you later, Mr. Brende.
As the organizer, I need 5 to 10 minutes to greet, and then, okay, I'm just...
Sure. Thank you.
Okay.
Director General Eren.
I will join in 5 minutes, probably.
Sure. So we'll come back to what partnerships can be created and what can be done within the wider economic community to help refugees. But let me turn to you now, Pierre Krähenbühl, because when we think about refugees, I think one people more than any other in the world almost symbolizes this issue, the Palestinian refugees. I know your organization, Unrwa, the UN Relief and Works Agency, has been going through a tough moment recently. You and I met last week on the margins of the UN General Assembly in New York, and we talked about this quote-unquote survival crisis now that the United States has decided not to give the chunk of the aid that used to be given to Unrwa, over $300 million. We talked about what this represents for your organization. Tell us in human terms what it means.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I think it's very intimately related to how we speak about people affected by crisis. And whenever I travel around the world, when I think about how can one best communicate what it means today to be a Palestine refugee, and what does it mean for a community to have been in a refugee situation for 7 decades, I think it's easy if one would ask anybody in this room, we can think about in each of our countries, what have been the landmarks of human history since the end of World War II? And if we would each take a few minutes, we would think about some very important moments. Some of us might choose to note the beginning and the end of apartheid or desegregation in the United States. We could list the building and the fall of the Berlin Wall. We could list specific sporting events or cultural events that have happened in different parts of the world. I think it's something like 15 Olympic Games and 17 football World Cups, and you could list it over that entire period since the end of World War II. And over that entire period, Palestine refugees have been refugees. And I think one of the incredibly important issues is to deeply, and you alluded to it in your opening remarks, to absolutely, resolutely refuse anonymity in suffering during conflict. Because however effectively we talk about the political dynamics of conflict, however we are tempted on the evening news to present the shift of front lines, the movement of airplanes, tanks, and others, the reality is that human beings are at the heart of conflicts. And I cannot accept that one reduces the victims to precisely that, to only victims or to numbers and statistics, as you pointed out. To just give you one example, this year in the Gaza Strip, and you have all followed it, there have been regular marches every Friday to protest against the situation and all of the emotions that have been created by the US announcement on Jerusalem, plus then the funding cuts to Unrwa and others. And there have been hundreds killed, thousands injured. But I want to name just a few. We lost 13 Unrwa students during these marches, and these marches have been largely peaceful events. We have a young Palestine refugee girl of 15 years old, Wesal, who was killed, shot by a sniper. We've had young boys, Izaldin or Mohammed, and many others. And I think it is, and Francesco mentioned this, it's a way of paying tribute to the individuals, to not forget the humanity that lies at the heart of their circumstances. This is probably one of the most important tasks that we have collectively. Otherwise, it makes the distance with which we may look at conflicts far too easy, and it may even lead us to greater inaction over time.
Mr. Krähenbühl, as you say, you focus again, as many of the guests who spoke before you, on the human aspect of this. The US's decision, though I come back to it briefly, to turn its back on Palestinian refugees, I think to put it bluntly, was undoubtedly motivated by strategic and political calculations. Much of it, I think, to do with the fact that there are some in Washington that want to strip the Palestinian refugees of their refugee status. But I just wonder if it isn't also a symptom of the larger and growing apathy toward this issue. So, for example, as we often do in the media and around the world, people look to the West, to the traditional wealthy nations, to donate and to fund, if not to provide answers. And perhaps also because there are certain historical responsibilities that the West and Western countries have in some of the crises and conflicts that have been created in the region. But should the richer countries of the region, Gulf countries, with all their wealth and all the money that is spent on purchasing weapons, shouldn't they be held to account? Should they be absolved from playing their role in this crisis and helping solve it and putting their money really where their mouths are?
So the first point is there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the decision that was taken by the United States to cut funding to Unrwa was taken for political reasons. It was not taken in relation to our performance, because the last visit that I carried out and had senior level contacts last year in Washington, on the contrary, confirmed a lot of recognition for the work that Unrwa does, for the way in which we do the work in a very polarized and highly emotional context. And we actually even signed in December last year a new framework agreement of cooperation with the United States. Then the announcement was made on Jerusalem with the issue of the embassy. Then that created a very intense and tense environment between the Palestinian leadership and the United States. And thereafter, the United States decided to cut the funding, all funding to Palestinian-related issues, including the funding to Unrwa, which is, sincerely said, quite unprecedented in my experience in terms of politicization of humanitarian aid. And this is exactly what should be prevented. One should not pursue political objectives with humanitarian funding. That's a very key issue. Now, you referred also to, should it be a shared commitment in a way? Should others step in? Where are the responsibilities? From my point of view, UNRWA was given its mandate. We are not a self-declared organization. You know, we were not a group of friends that woke up one day in 1949 and said, sounds like a nice thing to do. It is an expression, we are an expression of the collective will of the international community, and we're given a mandate by the General Assembly of the United Nations. It cannot be a more universally stated global commitment. And therefore, I think it is absolutely correct to expect that every single member state of the United Nations, to its abilities, should contribute. And one of the very positive elements this year is to see that in a time of crisis like UNRWA is facing, so many countries have stepped forward to mobilize additional funding. I want to pay tribute here in Turkey to the Turkish efforts, very remarkable, but also Gulf countries. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait have each contributed 50 million per country in this time of crisis, plus countries like India or others who were not historically as strongly engaged with UNRWA as it is this year. So I really want to signal that both it is a time of existential crisis, but there has also been a collective mobilization that is quite remarkable. And if you allow me just one additional remark, because of the length of the crisis. You know, UNRWA is sometimes blamed for having itself somehow perpetuated the reality of Palestine refugees. And I must say here that nothing has contributed more to this protracted and long duration of the Palestine refugeehood than the inability to resolve the conflict at the heart between Israel and Palestine. And that's just not going to go away. We cannot wish away 5.3 million people, the population of Norway or of Singapore, in the middle of this region, simply by stating that their children and grandchildren don't deserve to be recognized as refugees.
And I think, as you point out, in today's growingly interconnected world, everything becomes a threat, doesn't it? I mean, the instability we see in one part of the world could have an impact on the other. Many people wonder if this situation isn't, in fact, a ticking time bomb. Hopefully not. Hopefully, as you say, many people stepping in to help will make the difference. Though I think on the large scheme of things, and I don't mean to be overly cynical as a journalist, it might still be a drop in the ocean when we compare to the kind of funding that is given to so many other issues, namely the purchase of weapons, but I won't dwell. Francesco Rocca, of course, there's also a budgetary constraint, isn't there, for your organization to do its work the best way it can. I know when you took over earlier this year, I believe, or it was in 2017, when you took over, you said one of your priorities was to address integrity issues within your network. What kind of issues, what kind of challenges for you lie at the forefront of your priority list?
I think that one of the biggest responsibility that as a humanitarian organization we have is to be accountable. Accountable to our donors, accountable to those who we serve. And this is extremely important. It's a matter of fact that our organizations are made by people, and unfortunately, scandal could happen. We are not immune sometimes, this is very sad, some cases of fraud and corruption in the humanitarian organization. So I immediately worked with my colleagues of the board to increase our policies for having a zero tolerance on fraud and corruption, which is a top priority for us in dealing with this at all level, at Geneva level, but also on the ground at field level. We opened a safe call center just to receive any info from the ground in more than 100 languages, so that it will be possible to collect as much information as possible. And we are working also on setting up new policies at national level with the 191 national societies. So this is what we are doing because we are. This is a reason of concern, to be always accountable. We cannot be forgiven if we waste only €1, $1, 1 lira in what we are doing to serve those in need. And the other point on which we are working is to be to have zero tolerance on the sexual abuse and harassment, which is another topic in the humanitarian organization. And again, not only in those who are working, but even related to those we serve. So these are aspects of our life that we cannot deny. We must face the reality, and these are part of our challenges. And we are dealing with this. You know that many newspapers at the beginning of the year talked about this related to other organizations, but we felt that it was our duty to deal with this and to verify.
So a whole host of challenges on the ground, but also on the wider political, economic sphere as well. Burgi Brende, again, in your capacity now as president of the World Economic Forum, your constant interactions with people who can make a difference, not just at the political level, but people who can help with the fundraising, the private sector, civil society, but many other people who can play a role. What do you find is the most compelling thing you can say or do to help people realize that we need to move away from this current mindset of raison d'etat, really, which puts and prioritizes the security of borders, to one that prioritizes human lives? What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you. That's a big question. If I were to go back to the Sustainable Development Goals, I'm pretty sure that we cannot reach them without also mobilizing the private sector. And what you have seen during the last years is also an increasing consciousness in the private sector that you have to take issues related to sustainability, but also to development, gender, also the broader issues very seriously. Boston Consulting Group, BCG, came out with a report the other day where they had looked at 300 companies, and the report showed that those companies that had taken women on the board, had recruited in a very inclusive way, companies that also cared about the environment, companies that also took more responsibility than only to pay back to their shareholders, but also acknowledged the importance of their employees, but also society at large, were companies that were much more profitable than the others. And I think we're moving, of course, we are in a multipolar, multi-conceptual world. We're moving into the fourth industrial revolution. But I think we're also moving more from capitalism to talentism. The talents of the people is really what matters in companies. And I think the most talented and bright people would prefer to work for companies that also care about very important values that we already discussed there. And I think if the World Economic Forum, having some of the 1,000 most influential companies in the world as our partners, can push the envelope there, I think we will contribute also in a good way to make sure that the world continues to move in the right direction.
And as you mentioned, sustainability and making sure that the world continues to move in the right direction, not just politically and economically, but when I think of our planet, I know you've also warned about the threats of climate change, which of course can also exacerbate so many crises around the world, even actually lead to the creation of some crises. Look at the Sahel region, look at Syria and Darfur. How would you rate, though, the threats facing the world today in order of significance? When you look at climate change, when you look at nuclear war, global inequality, the issue of refugees, and I promised myself not to ask you a big question, but what would be your answer in a nutshell?
So on climate change, we have talked for decades about climate change. And we have talked about our grandchildren and our children. But climate change is happening on the ground now. It's a real, as you also mentioned. if you go to the Sahel region, if you go to those producing food in Africa, they're seeing huge impact already on the changing of the climate. And knowing that we will move probably from 7 billion people today to 10 billion people by 2050, we also have to increase the food production in the world without using more fresh water that also is scarce in many regions. If you look at the global risk picture that you really know addressing, what are the most pressing risks? I would say that things are still going pretty well in a lot of areas. Look at global growth, it's still 3.8% this year. But the risk factors are much more pressing than they were just 2-3 years ago. We came out with a report half a year ago, three-quarters of a year ago, global risk report that we do produce every year. And out of 9 most pressing risks, 5 of them were related to environment, being oceans, depleted fish stocks, climate change, biodiversity, so that is one. I think also now we have to admit that the situation when it comes to trade is very worrisome, because we know that trade has been the driver of growth, and trade has also included emerging markets in the global economy. I think we need to look at globalization is there, but globalization also has to be fairer and more equitable to secure it. And I think also emerging crises and geopolitical competition that in proxy wars and conflicts is a growing concern. And that can only be solved if we, again, are able to recreate more of a collaborative mood in the Security Council. Today, the mood in the Security Council, especially among the permanent members, is not where it should be.
Not the most collaborative mood, and perhaps not the most representative either of today's stakeholders. Pierre Krähenbühl, coming to this idea that Burgi Brende just ended on, this notion of partnerships. When you look around you, when you look at influential voices within the media, humanitarian organizations, economic organizations, what kinds of partnerships are crucial for you, for Unrwa, not just to change mindsets, but also to raise awareness and to raise the kind of funding that we were talking about earlier?
Yes, I think the partnerships are at all levels. So of course there is a state responsibility because we received the mandate from the General Assembly. So states have a real stake in Unrwa as part of the multilateral system that, by the way, today, if we just make a parenthesis here, is under assault. Much of what we have inherited after World War II as global frameworks, institutions, references, whether it's the UN Charter, the Human Rights Declaration, the Geneva Conventions, or the Refugee Conventions, are under assault and being questioned very severely. And I think here is where partnerships exist between civil society actors, between NGOs, international organizations like our own, and of course the political and media communities, to continue to raise attention. I think we cannot allow indifference to develop around the current level of attack, that some of the very foundations that we inherited from World War II are important. And why would I refer to World War II as being an important benchmark? Because it took the greatest calamity that mankind, and I think in this particular case we can underline mankind, ever inflicted on itself, for us to obtain these basic treaties, the Geneva Conventions of the laws that apply in armed conflict, the Refugee Conventions. And today we see politicians and different actors try and do away with the relevance of these frameworks, which again, it took the horrors of World War II for us to establish. We should be defending these with all our energy, just as we should, because you raised the issue of consciousness. One thing that strikes me after over a quarter century of working in conflict zones is I think we really need to redevelop a consciousness around the rejection of the notion that wars are inevitable. It is just too simple to tolerate the idea. When you see the human consequences of them, we give in to this notion that wars are inevitable much too easily. And I think it needs for us to rediscover the value, something that Burgi Brende knows very well from his years of investment, for example, on the Colombian conflict, that at the end of the day, conflicts are solved by talking to one another. Yeah. And much more should be invested in conflict resolution rather than in conflict management. We have spent the past 2 decades, and you can go to international fora, to academic institutions, and you will see how many papers have been produced about conflict management. As I always say, you can manage the Israel-Palestine conflict forever, and you will have Unrwa forever in that equation. Put the energies into resolving the conflict, and we can create a different horizon for Palestinians, for Israelis, for everyone in the region, and in particular for Palestine refugees, because as they say very often, and our students say it in every international forum, we had it again at the General Assembly last week, where 2 of our students addressed many of the fora and said, we never asked to be refugees. We want to be recognized, not for our refugee status only, but for our skills, our determinations, our ability to contribute. And both Asil and Ahmad had a huge impact, and actually it's the only standing ovation that I can remember in the week that I spent in New York.
And it's not a choice that they have either. But I think you raised the issue of a mistake that we often make, that wars are inevitable. I think another one that we tend to make as well is that refugee crises are just short-term, immediate. But as the Palestinian refugee crisis will attest to, they turn into long-term, protracted conflicts. So turning to you, Francesco Rocca, one more time, is there adequate international support to make sure that refugee crises actually have the kind of system that is needed in these countries, the middle-income countries of the neighborhood? We talked about Turkey, host to the biggest number of Syrian refugees, but also Jordan and Lebanon. Is there enough support being lent to these countries to deal with the situation on the ground from your experience? Or should there be some kind of partnership with the private sector as well?
Of course, the partnership of the private sector is extremely important. But what I was wondering just in this day, it's something a bit different from your question. I think that we would love to fill the gap between the continued statements that we hear from the leaders all over the world about the taking care of the refugees, of the migrants, and the action on the field, and the policies that they are setting up at national level. This is what is the biggest reason of concern, because if any political leader or global leader would really follow what they always state at the mic in every arena or podium that they normally use with concrete action, maybe many of the crises could be fixed. Then coming to your question, yes, I think that the humanity, could seem that I'm going against myself, but this is to fix the issue. Humanitarian aid is not enough. Dignity is something more. Thinking at the experience of Turkey, or maybe Jordan now about the Queen Rania, of course, we have a lot of people that are hosted in this country, especially those who are fled Syria, but many of these people have not any possibility or opportunity to work, not because there is no commitment, but because there are not enough opportunities. So I wonder if the global finance is enough to let this economy grow. Because we have to create new opportunity. Because for a country that is hosting in 1 year 2 million more citizens, like happens in Turkey a few years ago, now they have reached 3 million, then you need the economy to grow. It's not only about rice or chicken and food.
But you raise a very, very crucial question, in addition to the issue of dignity and the fact that the refugee crisis should probably not be looked at as an issue of aid and charity. There are human lives involved and people who want to make a contribution to the societies in which they live, too often much longer than they would like to. Burgi Brende, on this note, what Francesco Rocca just mentioned, creating opportunities for some of these refugees. Some of them live in refugee camps like the Zatari refugee camp. I forget the exact numbers, but I think something like 80,000 people live there without the option to really go out and work. I mean, they create their own little working communities from within. But Can the private sector, do you think, be incentivized to create employment that would benefit refugee communities?
So during the high-level week now at the UN, we initiated from the World Economic Forum, from ICRC and the World Bank, a high-level panel on how we could also bring in the private sector more, also in those protracted crises that we are seeing in humanitarian crisis. I think when there is acute crisis, I think we have to rely on the humanitarian organizations. They should be also sufficiently financed, of course. But when you are building back or you have recovery phase, I think we can also rely more on private sector. I think the whole thinking around humanitarian contributions have changed during the last years. Before, it was unthinkable to contribute with cash, for example. But what we did when you fly in food, fly in all kind of equipments, you also kill the infrastructure that is already there. I saw it myself when I was in Haiti during and after the earthquake there. I think we would have been better off giving the people cash so that we could have still kept some of the infrastructure, food production that is local. And it is a paradox that some countries also then fly in food when there is food also locally available if you had the resources. I would also like to say, though, that we can, of course, do more from the industrialized world. We can do more from the private sector. But I think also in some developing countries, we can expect more national resource mobilization. We know that illicit financial flows are a big problem. We also know that corruption is a huge problem. 25% of the GDP just disappears in some countries because of corruption. Totally unacceptable. We should be much tougher. And then on top of it, we see also that for any country that wants to move from being a poor country to being a middle-income country, you have to accept that you have to have proper tax collection. And we see countries, developing countries, where 5 to 10% of GDP, the taxes amount to 5 to 10% of GDP. In my country, Norway, taxes are close to 40% of GDP. That's redistribution, but it's investing in health, it's investing in education. And how can you in a developing country, for example, then say, oh, all landowners, the bigger you are more accepted from paying taxes than others. This is not sustainable. So I think we have to think also out of the box. Everyone has to contribute, of course, then provided that you have the means. And if you start to pay taxes, it is also that you will then get more integrated in the society, and you will also then be a critical voice when it comes to corruption and how you use the resources in the country, because this is your contribution to build the hospitals and to build the schools.
A solution from within as well as a solution from the outside world. I'm looking at the clock, 5.5 minutes left. In a few words, if I can get to each one of you with your closing thoughts and comments. Pierre Krähenbühl, beginning with you in a nutshell or two. What is for you the way forward? What kind of actions would you like to see taken to deal proactively with the issue of Palestinian refugees?
So, what is the most important, and if we had to set everything else aside, including the work that Unrwa does, it is to resolve the conflict between Israel and Palestine. But not just to pay lip service. You know, we go to international meetings and people will pledge their renewed allegiance to the two-state solution. But I can pledge my allegiance to world peace. It means nothing if I don't act on it. And so I really have to say that it's not enough now to say, we have tried everything, you know, the parties don't want to. Look at the human costs and the costs in terms of regional stability and insecurity, both in the Middle East and beyond. Europe has rediscovered it in 2015 with the arrivals of large numbers of refugees and migrants and all the debates it has triggered. Surely a collective remobilization on the political solution is required. That would be the most important. In the meantime, yes, I continue to call for, as I did this year, knocking on every door, for the continued support to UNRWA to provide the ongoing services. And I just want to say something about the word dignity, because my biggest discovery when joining UNRWA, after 20 years with the International Red Cross, was not so much about the emergency side of work, the food distributions, the medical assistance, things that you normally associate with armed conflict. It was the education. I have never seen in my life a humanitarian organization commit in this way to education on a large scale. 526,000 boys and girls in UNRWA's education system from Aleppo to Rafah and Gaza. And this is something which allows you to not look at the person only as a victim of violence and dispossession, but also as an actor of his or her own destiny. And there's nothing more powerful than to be able to give these young boys and girls a horizon, a prospect, and something that can allow them to meet with their aspirations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's all about creating a hope in addition to creating the right environment. Francesco Rocca, your final thoughts. You talked a few moments ago about the need for action. What kind of action?
I think that I couldn't agree more with what Pierre just said. I think action is a cultural action, of course. For us, we always are on the spot. We try to respond to any emergencies. But what we do need in this moment in the world is an increased cultural awareness about referring to our principles, and first to our first principle, humanity. What does it mean, humanity? What does it mean? And I liked in the premises of this meeting when you touched the point on the human security. This is extremely important, more than the national security. If with our leaders, our politicians, we will restart in dealing with the word humanity, I think really we could have a better world. This is something extremely important. And let me end with something that I'm very proud of. I was thinking 1 second ago that the three men on the podium are all coming from we have all something in common, the Red Cross family. Because Børge has been Secretary General of the Norwegian Red Cross, and Pierre has served for many years. So how important is the word humanity, the first principle of the Red Cross?
Well, that's very interesting. So then my final words to you, Burgi Brende. Putting on your very many hats, including your humanitarian hat, what would you like to see happen to rebalance the flow of energy, for the lack of a better word, when it comes to dealing with the refugee crisis?
I think we need to be willing to address the elephant in the room when it comes to some of these crises, because they are increasingly proxy crises. Of course, maybe they started with conflicts inside the country, but the conflicts are also fueled by external actors. So I think those external actors have to be held accountable, and we have to address it. So the political cost will increase. That's one side of it. Secondly, I think on the migration piece, not only talking about refugees, but also the broader migration piece, I think Pierre's point, not only, of course, related to Palestinians, but broader, I think education is a prerequisite for development, and especially among the young. And there are still 70 million children today that don't go to school, and many children also go to schools where they really don't learn anything. The quality of the teachers, the quality of the school is so low that is really nothing that they get out of that education. I think this cannot continue, and we have to really make sure that we don't lose additional generations. And for me also, education for girls is so important. Educated girls, if they are in school, marry later. They also have a tendency to then be working. They get less children where that is a challenge. And of course, then you also can increase the level of welfare in your society if more people do take part in the workforce. So I think we are, in many ways, at the crossroads globally these days. Are we going to continue to believe in a win-win world? What is good for your country is good for my country, and vice versa. Are we going to live in a world where we also would like to include emerging economies in the global economy? Are we going to continue to trade with each other and make a win-win world? Or are we going to choose another path that is not going to create the same kind of opportunities? So thank you for also putting these kind of issues on the agenda here during your conference or summit or forum.
Critical questions, as you say. Hopefully we've provided some of the answers. The conversation will no doubt continue, but on this hopeful note, Burgi Brende, Pierre, Krähenbühl, Francesco Rocca, and of course, Ibrahim, Eren, who had to leave us a little early. Thank you all very much indeed for your thoughts, for joining us in this fascinating and very vital discussion. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.